Okay, so while everyone is filtering in, I'll just kick us off. So welcome to our Accessibility in Design event with some very special guests from Google. First off, I'd like to introduce Digital Society to those of you who might not be familiar with it. At DigiSoc, we are committed to building a strong and supportive community of students who are interested in all things digital, regardless of degree or background. What sets us apart is that we focus on digital strategy, UI UX design, and innovation within the business, technology, and design space. Okay. Now I'd like to welcome our special guests for today. So Preethi is a senior UX researcher at Google. She focuses her work on understanding and designing products or services that empower people and change lives in meaningful ways. At Google, she helps understand the needs supporting elegant developer experiences. Pablo is a UX program manager at Google, and for the last 15 years, he has been creating digital products and experiences that put the user at the center of the process. At Google, he works with the Google Cloud AI department, creating the next generation of conversational artificial intelligence. In today's agenda, Preethi and Pablo will be covering how Google designs for people from all different walks of life to ensure a user experience that is inclusive and universal. This will be followed by a small exercise as well as a Q&A at the end. So here is a slider for the Q&A section. You can send in your questions during the event via the link that Vera will put in the chat, or you can just scan the QR code. For those who haven't used Slider before, just go to slider.com and enter the code here, or you can just scan the QR code on your mobile. And lastly, before we commence with the workshop, please take a minute to fill in the attendance form, which will be sent in the chat as well. Yeah, are we good to go, or should we wait, Vera?
Yes, we're good to go. Preethi, Pablo, are you ready?
Okay, I'll now hand it over to you guys to start.
Yep, all ready. Let me share my screen and we'll get started. Can you confirm that you're seeing the screen okay? The presentation screen?
Yep.
All right. All right. So as Jessica introduced, we're here to talk a little bit about accessibility in product design. So today, the plan is we're going to learn a little bit about the basics of accessibility. I find accessibility to be a super interesting field that is not very often taught in schools. I don't know if your classes have touched on the subject at all, but it's something that we find a lot of people are not very well trained by the time they start working. And I think it's something that it's important to start thinking about early. We will discuss user research and how it applies to accessibility. And we will build a better understanding of how accessible products are designed and built. And I'll give you guys a quick thinking exercise so you get a little bit your hands dirty on thinking about how we do these things. We'll do quick introductions, even though Jessica already introduced us. But as I mentioned, my name is Pablo Arce. I am originally from Spain, but live in San Francisco, as this picture clearly shows. Kind of ubiquitous Golden Gate Bridge picture that you almost see from everyone in San Francisco, except mine's taken from a boat. I'm a big sailor, so I love water. Can't wait to sail in the Sydney harbor at some point in my life. I started my career as a civil engineer. I got my bachelor's and my master's in civil engineering, but I decided that really what I wanted, what I liked in my life was always digital experiences. So I started transitioning to that about 15 years ago and worked at a number of product agencies and eventually made my move to Google, which had always been kind of my top destination. So I'm glad to be here and looking forward to introducing these very important topics to you. Preethi?
Thanks, Pablo. Hello, everyone. My name is Preethi. Originally from India, but I also live in California. I started off with a master's in computer science, transitioned over to a PhD in human-computer interaction. A lot of my early career was with helping lead research and design at a health nonprofit before I transitioned to being a UX researcher at Google. At Google, I play two roles. One is with helping software developer research, and more recently, I've been helping search team think about how they present crisis alerts. So that's me. So let's get started with getting to know about accessibility. Next slide. Next. Okay, so what is accessibility, right? So accessibility in general, it means that you're actually building products so that everyone can easily use them, right? And this includes people with disabilities. And accessibility, what it really does is it kind of ensures that people with disabilities are able to sort of understand, they are able to perceive, navigate, and interact with your products or like tools and whatever services that you're implementing, right? The idea here really is you want everyone to be able to participate equally without sort of any sort of barrier. Next slide. What I'm going to do now is I'm actually going to have Pablo, click the next button, and we're going to have like 3 images placed side by side. So one of the things I would, go ahead, Pablo. Let's have all the 3 images side by side. One of the things I would actually encourage the attendees in the chat, drop a note saying what you think is common between each of these images. And feel free to drop in any comment. And I guess just to keep with time, I would keep proceeding, but we'll revisit the chat box. Yep, great. So I'm seeing a few folks say movement is restricted, and disability and so on. Yes, but there is this difference, right? Now there is some kind of restriction, but the difference here is in the context, right? So on the left, you have like permanent disability, and then in the middle, you're really thinking about something that's temporary, and towards the right, it is a situational. Right now, one of the takeaway message that I would have for attendees who are attending this workshop is everyone experiences some degree of impairment at some point in their life. And that is something that I would like every one of you to take away from this workshop, if not anything, right? Next slide. What we have here is like an example, is another example, right? So here again, we have 3 different situations, but we are really thinking about visual impairment in this case, right? Again, we have something that's permanent, something that's temporary, and then with those eyeglasses, and then something that's situational with like, sunlight kind of making it difficult to look at like a device in bright sun. Next slide. Now, disabilities at a higher level, right? So this is not an exhaustive list, but we have thought about a couple of categories for disability. So it could be related to mobility, it could be sensory, where you're thinking about whether the person is able to hear or see. And then there's something that's related to neurodiversity, mental health, and chronic health conditions. And then the last bit there is about developmental or intellectual disability. And disability can actually affect any of us at any time, right? So as I said earlier, it could be permanent, it could be temporary, or it could be situational. Now, people in general, who don't have disabilities can also be impacted with disability, right? So some of it could be running in the family. It could be that, close friends, you could be close friends with someone who's having disability. Now, chances are that we'll all be affected with some sort of disability in our lives, right? And a classic example is as we age, there's a high chance that we are going to have some kind of impairment. Next slide. Now, why do we even care, right? Why think about accessible design? Why think about accessible, like user research related to accessibility? There are about 15% in the entire world population who live with disability, right? There's approximately about 1 billion, but I would actually encourage folks to go look at that link post this workshop just to see what that the actual number is. The second thing is that in the US particularly, about a year or so ago, there was about 18% of people with disabilities who were actually employed. And you can actually compare this to about 62% of people who did not have any disability, right? So we really want to be paying attention to this population. And there are a couple of studies from United Nations, and they tend to show that only about 45 countries have anti-discrimination or any other kind of disability-specific law, right? So it's important that we try to incorporate this in any product. Next slide. Now, specifically for Google, accessibility is it's so important that it's actually baked into or incorporated in our mission statement, right? So our mission statement is to organize world's information and make it universally accessible, right? And also useful. So this is something that we pay a close attention to in all our products and services. Next slide. And now a few things to think about. One of the key differences between impairment and disability. Now, oftentimes this is a confused term. The word impairment is used to refer to someone's ability or like an actual attribute, right? That can affect a person. Such as, when someone's not able to walk or they're not able to breathe independently. Whereas disability is actually used to refer to restrictions that is caused by the society. It's something that's introduced as a construct in the society, right? And when what it really does is it does not give equal attention to it, does not accommodate the needs of everyone. That's what we mean when we are referring to disability. Next slide. To give you an example, so think about like an inaccessible experience, right? So imagine that you have an able-bodied person and they do not speak Japanese, right? And they are trying to have a conversation with a Japanese native who can speak only in Japanese, and they are in a Japanese wheelchair. Now, if you were to think about who is having a higher level of disability, you would actually, some people might be referring to the person in the wheelchair, but actually in reality, it's the able-bodied person who is not able to have a conversation in native Japanese, who is disabled in this condition. So Pablo, if you can actually forward, yeah. So here what we are really referring to is disability is not a personal health condition, but it's actually a mismatched interaction. Next slide. And what we really want to be thinking about when designing accessible products is you want to be thinking about creating a product that addresses this mismatch, right? And it allows everyone to use it. And here's a classic example, right? In this image, you have you have steps, and then you also have a ramp so that a wheelchair user can also, go to a higher level, right? Next slide. I'm actually going to switch topics and I'm going to start talking about assistive technologies. Right now, assistive technology could be, you can think of it as any tool or a system, right? That kind of improves and it maintains that functional capability for people with disability, right? And we have a couple of examples. Now, this can actually range across a spectrum, right? So you have something that's like a low-tech solution to something that's like a high-tech solution. So on the high-tech end, you can think about devices like Braille or like, hardwares like prosthetic limbs or even like a voice control software, right? And on the low end, on the low-tech end, you can think about something like magnifying glass or even like a ramp that, we saw on the previous slide, or like a paper flashcards. Next slide. What we have here is like we've basically just broken down assistive technologies based on different facets of disability, right? So if you're thinking about vision, you can think about a solution that can increase the font size, or something that can be used for magnification. If you're thinking about hearing, then captions would be an example of assistive technology. If someone has motor disability, you can think about something like a keyboard or a voice input that could be used for making the interaction more accessible. And then if someone has cognitive disability, then something like autocomplete. I think this is something most of us are familiar with, like predictive text, right? As we are writing a text message, we start to see these recommendations for what can go in the remainder of the phrase or sentence. Next slide. A few more examples, and we can go through this real quick. The first one here is voice control. What voice control really does is it allows the user to launch apps. The user can adjust volume, they can edit text. This is something that I would actually encourage folks to go check out. We have voice access on Android. It's a pretty cool feature. So please do check this out after the workshop. Next slide. The next most interesting assistive technology is switch device. Right? It's often used by people with motor disabilities. Now, what you see here is you see those two squares. There's a white one and an orange one. The white one really helps a person to advance or traverse forward. The orange one is used for going backward when a person is looking at a content on the screen. And this was actually used by Stephen Hawking, for example, right? So he was actually diagnosed with ALS, which is like a motor neuron disease. I think this was this was 1963 or so, and he used switch devices primarily for communication. Next slide. So again, another classic example is magnification, right? Here again, if you have not tried out this feature, go ahead and try using this post the workshop. You can actually set the font size of everything that you see on your phone screen. There are several other zoom features, and this is something I think we tend to do even with pictures. On the next slide here, we have Braille devices. This typically assists people who are blind and to kind of read and write. The top buttons there, they are basically used for inputting characters. Those small rounded pins at the bottom, they are used for like reading with fingertips. Next slide. Screen readers, another classic example. This basically assists users for verbalizing the content on the screen. This is actually heavily dependent on what a software developer has implemented when it comes to implementing accessibility within like a website or even a mobile app, right? And users in general, they tend to move their focus through the content typically when they are using this functionality, right? It could be either using a keyboard or using a Braille device. And the interactive content, such as, it could be like links or like buttons, and those are verbalized along with other critical information whenever this functionality is used. So here's an example, right? So for instance, when someone has, focused on this menu item rental cars, what this screen reader does is it calls out the text, which is rental cars. Next, it calls out the role of this text, right, which is that this is a link. And the last part is it calls out where it is within the group. So right now there are 3 items in this menu, so it is the 3rd item of a group of 3 items, right? So this is something that you might be revisiting later in this workshop when Pablo is helping you walk through like an exercise. Right, next slide. Assistive technologies in general tend to rely on, behavior that could be attached to like a keyboard navigation or a screen reader, right? So if there's one thing that you really want to address, if you really want to introduce accessibility in your product, like if you really want to build an accessible product, try to focus on these 2 things, right? So that means you've actually covered most of the accessible needs for disabled people. Next slide. Okay, I'm now going to switch topics and talk about my favorite topic, which is user research. Right now, user research at a fundamental level, it's basically like an analytical effort, right? It uses social sciences and computing science techniques to sort of understand where users are coming from, what are their motivations or aspirations, what are their intentions, their behavior, what are their attitudes, and how do they actually interact with a product or a service. Next slide. Now, you might be wondering, who are the users we are talking about, right? Now, users are people. They could be like family members, they could be friends, relatives, loved ones. Now, one of the things you would want to think about when you're designing a product is you may want to think about the context of use, right? Now, some users may actually rely on your product on a day-to-day basis for basic tasks. Some of them may be using your product to help find like an address to a restaurant they can eat at. Right, so by involving users in your product design and development process, you begin to respect the user. Next slide. What this really means is you want to be focusing on the user and you want to help improve their lives, right? So you want to focus not on just one user, you want to actually start thinking about everyone. And in this process, you want to actually give a voice to people so that they can help you when you're building a better product, right? And this kind of collective impact will be much greater than what you can achieve just by yourself or just within your team, right? And what another takeaway point that I would highlight for folks is when you're designing a product, think about working with the users instead of working for the users. That really introduces this concept of inclusive design. And the last bit there is also very important. Treat every bit of data that you are able to capture during user research the way that you would want your data to be treated, right? So there's really nothing for us without the concept of us in accessible and inclusive design. Next slide. I have linked in a video here. We are not going to actually watch the video now, but I would encourage folks to go watch this video. This is a great talk by Alice Roy, where she talks about how when we start designing for the disabled, we are actually designing a product that will benefit for everyone. Right. So the takeaway point from this talk is that without observing and hearing from a diverse set of users, we cannot fully understand their experience or their challenges or insights that would in turn benefit everyone. Right. So in the end, we would actually end up missing out on a number of potential new users who could be using your product, or even users who are using the product but are having something like a temporary disability. Next slide. So now, having spoken about all of this, you may have a question like, so when in the process do we actually introduce accessibility in user research? Again, I would actually encourage folks to put in chat when you would start thinking about accessibility in user research. Oh, yes. Pablo probably has actually moved on to the next slide, I guess, kind of letting everyone know when. Anytime, really. Anytime you're doing. I see a really good chat here that says embedded from the beginning, and that was our that was our advice as well. In general, you can introduce or start to think about accessibility anytime in the product development process. It's still research, but the earlier you do that, the better. Right. Next slide. Now, to give you a little bit of more context, because this workshop is not focused entirely on user research, I'm kind of limited with sharing more about what are these different user research methodologies. But I have a link in the following slide that will give you an introduction to some of that. But at a high level, if you were to think about like a product development process, right from the point where it's in an idea phase to the point where it is launched, there are different points where you can introduce user research, right? Anywhere from something that is super formative to something that's evaluative. So in a formative phase, you can think about something like ethnographic, where you are trying to observe how people use a product, or observe and identify what is a need that you should be solving for. It could be also like a survey, to something like evaluative, where you have created the first version or a couple of version 1 or version 2 of the product, and you basically just want to go see how people use that and gather feedback. Next slide. Now, the next slide here, as I mentioned earlier, there's a link again at the end of the workshop. Feel free to go look at that. It has a list of different methods. But what I've done here is there is a table here which kind of speaks to each research methodology, when you like at a high level what that methodology is and how you can make it more inclusive, like how you can introduce accessible research. So for instance, if you're interviewing, a typical interview would involve like you asking questions, right? You observing users and understanding their needs and behaviors. The way you can start to make it so that it helps with building accessible product is you can include about 1 to 3 participants with disabilities in your interviews, right? Another example is with like usability study, for instance. So that's a typical usability study. You would actually have someone talk aloud while they are using your product. Right. And how can you make it more accessible is you can get at least 5 users using some kind of assistive technology use your product. So that way you can find out if the product you've created is accessible. Again, I'm not going to spend too much time on this, but feel free to look at this at the end of the workshop. With that, I'm actually going to hand off to Pablo to continue on with the workshop.
All right. Thank you, Preethi. So now that we've figured out who our users are, hopefully through the research, let's talk about accessibility in design. And I'll start that by reminding us of this picture that Preethi shared. This is a well-designed product that addresses the needs of disabled and able-bodied people, right? So you have to be aware of your users. You have to think who your users might be. And because we're talking about digital products, and at the end of the day, that mostly the case, what you want to do with a digital product is distribute content or have accessible content from some sort. You have to think how your user might need to access your product. So they might, what might be their visual needs? What could be their problems? Could they not see at all? Could they be partial vision only? Could their hands be limited? Could they not touch the device at all? Is it possible that they cannot hear or are very bad at hearing? Maybe they can't speak or they have limited speech abilities. And lastly, mental issues, such as being forgetful, can keep track of tasks, or having problem understanding. So thinking about all of these things as you're designing the product is super important. Thinking about how these interactions that we take for granted are going to happen with someone else. This is an important slide, and this addresses kind of the why you want to take disability and accessibility from the beginning. Doing it as an afterthought or doing what you call bolt-on accessibility can very easily lead to terrible design and terrible experiences, which not only that, but it can be extremely costly because you might have to go back and fix and change a lot of things in your product. It can lead to losing users by having just not such a good experience and not being able to users not being able to address the changes that you might have to do later. And you could even use hurt users. Imagine a user that is, because he is disabled and he might be slower at reacting to a map direction or is distracted by something, could get hit by a car while walking on the street. Simply because you didn't think about accessibility early enough. So bolted on afterthought solution typically results in bad design if you're not really careful. However, on the other end of the spectrum, you can build a product from the very beginning, thinking about accessibility and creating something that's beautiful and extremely useful for both people with disabilities and people without. So in this case, for instance, we're talking about the EON watch. This is a watch that's specifically designed for blind people. Basically, it works exactly the same as a regular watch. The sphere that's closest to the center is the hours. And if you look in the top right, there's an outer sphere, and that's the minutes. So it's great. It allows a blind user to tell the time and have a stylish timepiece in his hands. But at the same time, it's a design that can be used by anyone. It shows respect for your users because you've been taking care of their needs from the beginning. It makes you deeply think about the product and understand what the real basis of the product is and how it could help others. And it can easily help people outside of the target audience. So imagine, for instance, you're in a meeting or in a conversation and you don't want to look at your watch, but at the same time, you really want to know the time. So you can easily touch around and feel the time, and that's a use for a sighted user that could take advantage of this design. There's a a famous effect called the Carb Cut Effect. Essentially, what the Carb Cut Effect is, any design of that is created, a product that's created with the needs of a disabled group, that benefits so many other people. So for instance, the reason why it's called Carb Cut Effect is, I'm not sure if this is the same language that you would use in Australia, but the curb cut is those ramps that you use on the sidewalk that were originally designed for wheelchair users, but obviously the use goes well beyond from wheelchairs. Anyone that's walking around with a suitcase or pushing a cart or a stroller, or skateboarders, bike riders, it really makes things better for everyone. So let's focus now. So everything that I've been covering up until now were physical products, just because it's sometimes easier to relate to certain concepts if you focus on physical products. But let's focus on digital products now. So with the digital curb cut effect on digital products means essentially designing digital products with accessibility in mind, built for thinking about disabled users, but really rethinking, distilling, and optimizing interactions. So focus on those users, but in a way that will help everyone else. I think closed caption is a great example of this. Closed captions were originally built for deaf people. However, I think all of us very often are reading captions for whatever reason, we cannot have the volume up, or the show has a slightly different accent. I know, I'm a native of Spain. English is not my first language. So sometimes, especially when I'm watching a British show, I turn on the captions just so I understand better and I'm able to follow better. Simplicity in a product is not easy. It's not easy distilling all of this into a simple, smart product, but it's definitely worth it. A good product must be, there's essentially 4 principles that we use in accessibility. A good product must be perceivable, so the user has to know that what content and elements exist and how to find the information and interaction points. It has to be operable. The user has to be able to use the interaction points and follow the flow of the experience, even if they're using assistive technology. It has to be understandable. So the user has to be able to comprehend what the content is, what the interaction points mean, and what is expected of them along the way. And lastly, it has to be robust. Basically, the experience that you build has to be accessible as technology advances, as things change. It has to take things such as the different settings that the user is utilizing in their device or system, and not break when, for instance, someone changes a setting, as we'll see later. So I wanted to give a couple of examples of each of these principles. So for instance, in the perceivable camp, we have text contrast. So you are all young and probably have good eyes, but as you get older, you'll start seeing that your ability to differentiate contrast goes down quickly. So there's certain ratios that you want to hit to be more accessible. So obviously the largest ratio that you can have is either black over white or white over black, and that's typically a 21-to-1 ratio. But the world is not black and white. If all design was black and white, it would be really boring. So there's other ratios, there's other grays. Obviously, this is focused on blacks and whites and gray, but all colors you can find the ratios that work with you. What's important to think about here is be mindful of contrast ratios. Very often designs look better with gray on gray, or low contrast ratios, but know that that will make your product harder to read for many users. Another important example is not depending on color alone to convey information. So for instance, if an error message only shows this red box, like on the top, to signify an error, that might leave a lot of people with color blindness out of the equation. They might not read that red. Some colorblind people actually don't see color at all, and some might not realize that it's actually red. So always use something beyond color to give any kind of significance. Let's talk about some examples of operable. So user being able to use assistive tech is important. And we'll go a little bit later on keyboard access, but it's extremely important that that a product that is accessible can be used with screen readers and with keyboards, as Preethi said. Basically, all assistive technologies are based on the inputs from those technologies. So that's your main one of your main targets when you develop a product is those two. The other thing, for instance, for operable is having properly sized touch targets. If touch targets are small, you might very well have people that have tremors, or just in general. I remember when cell phones first were released, and the screens were a lot smaller, the keys were a lot closer. It was so easy to type the wrong thing. Even today, if you're going fast, we know we misspell things often. Thank God sometimes for that spell check, but having things the right size is really important. Having touch targets the right size is a really important consideration. A product has to be understandable. So when a screen reader, for instance, is used in your product, you have to be describing the action of the interactive element, and make sure that you're very clear and direct on what the element is doing. So you don't want to say pencil in the first case, or question, or disk. You want to tell the user what that element is going to do. The fact that it's a pencil is a purely decorative thing, right? That's really only for sighted people. You see that it's a pencil and you understand that it's edited, but it doesn't matter that it's a pencil. Lastly, well, not lastly, but another point within understandable is we all see websites. This is kind of a pet peeve of mine. You see a lot of websites that has this learn more links, learn more. Imagine now that you're looking at a website that has eight pieces of content, each one of them with a learn more link, and you're a blind user and you're using a screen reader. You're scanning through the page. You're seeing the screen reader is reading the text, then it tells you to learn more. And it does that 8 times, right, for each of the sections. Now you realize that you want to go back to the third one. If you only navigate through the learn mores, you will not necessarily remember what the third one was leading you to. If you can see the content, you can, but why not give a link that actually has more meaning? Why not give a link that tells you what you're going to learn more if you go to that link? So rather than learn more, give a little bit more context. Say learn more about accessibility, or learn more about whatever that section is relevant. Just make people's lives easier. The last principle is making products robust. So it's super important that as you build a product, you are taking into consideration things such as settings and other things that the user might be changing. As we described earlier, one of the things that a user may be changing is font size. So if the user changes font size and your UI breaks, there's a serious issue, right? So here the user is only having the font size increased a little bit and it's already breaking. how can you build a product so that that doesn't happen? Maybe you have to stack things differently. Maybe you have to make it adaptable. But thinking about that is what matters. Things that might be changes. Things like, you know, dark mode. Maybe a user uses the dark mode because they're very sensitive to the light of a white device. Respect that. You respect the contrast, display sizes, etc. So now we're going to get into the interaction model of keyboard navigation. As I mentioned, this is going to be a little bit of more kind of like getting to the meat of it and being a little bit more practical. So how does keyboard navigation work? I don't know if you guys have tried this before. I definitely had not had much experience with it before I started working on accessibility. If you think about how interaction works, when you work on a mouse, you're working in 2 dimensions, right? You can move up and down and left and right at any time. However, for keyboard navigation, you're really using 1 dimension. You're going forwards and backwards, and that's all. Obviously in a linear sequence. For keyboard navigation, what you use typically is a tab key. So tab key is typically advanced to the next interactive element. Remember, keyboard navigation only tabs interactive elements. So links, buttons, things like that. The text content is not addressed by screen navigation. That's typically addressed by either a screen reader, or if you're a sighted user, then you use reading. So shift and tab typically moves you back to the prior interactive element. So most browsers actually give you this interaction of the tab navigation for free. This is just basically built in on pretty much every browser. However, there's other interactions that might not be, and that you might have to tell your developer to implement. For instance, when you get to a list or something like that, you might want to transverse it with the arrow keys, going up and down or left and right, however that list is working. Drop downs, things like that, you might prefer to access it that way, and we'll see why later. Remember, when you're doing keyboard navigation, it's very important that the user is super clear on where they are at any point. Obviously, when you have a pointer, you have the pointer always telling you where you are on the screen, and it even changes shapes when you find an interactive element. When you're doing keyboard navigation, you have to make sure that the element that you are on is highlighted in some way. It should be visible at all times. I find this site, which is actually about accessibility, and it's from the UK, does a really good job. So instead of just putting an underline, it very clearly puts the element where you're at, the interactive element where you're at. It changes the color, it highlights it in yellow, it puts this underline under it, and as you go to the next one, it does that in the next element. So it's super clear which element you're at every time. I encourage you to visit this site. It actually has a lot of really interesting information. And lastly, just when you get to the element that you want to access, just like with mice, you click a button. With keyboard navigation, you would press Enter or the spacebar. So this is where we get to the small exercise. It's going to be really quick. I'll give you 2 or 3 minutes to think about this. But imagine this site, right? It's, I think, a very typical page for a airline search engine. So let's think about a user. Let's think about a user that's in a wheelchair and has limited arm mobility. She cannot use a mouse, but she can use keyboard navigation. Let's think about keyboard navigation through this page. Specifically, let's talk if this user wants to go to the filters and wants to make sure that she selects a non-stop flight in business class. Now, remember I told you about tab navigation is how you would move from one element to the next. If you only use tab navigation, by the time you get to the filters, you've done 94 tabs in this example because there's 88 flights. So every tab would get you, the first tab would get you to this adult selection. Second one would be the destination, the departure city. Third one would be the destination, date, and then start going through each of the flights. By the time you get to the filters, you're done with this. You have no longer any interest in addressing this. So, and this is going to be a little bit tricky to do with the text, but I would love if you could think of how you can improve this interaction. I'll give you 2 minutes. It's 50 past the hour. Let's go until 52. So 2 minutes from now, write down how you think you can improve this interaction so it's not 94 tabs to get to the filters that you want to access. I don't have wait music and you don't want me singing, so I'm just going to be quiet for a second, but I'm going to look at some of the answers as we go.
Looks like
Okay.
they want you singing, Pablo.
Yeah, that's probably not going to happen. It would be nice to have rain. We've had a pretty dry season in San Francisco, but I'm afraid that it's not for anyone's interest that I start singing now. Anyway, so let me read a little bit on the answers that I'm seeing. Add the use of arrow keys, and that is definitely one of the ways to go. In order to do that, you have to do something, and I'm not gonna talk about it yet because I want to see if anyone else says it in the list. So next position, Daphne said, position the filter menu as a section above the results. That's excellent. That's a complete different approach to the arrow keys that also addresses the thing. So Matthew said the same. Put the filters on top. We want you singing. No, sing no. Yeah. So basically, you're getting into it, right? Like there's essentially multiple ways that you can do this. One is change the structure of the page so it fits better the interaction that you want. The other approach is, as Oliver said, use of the arrow keys. So, for instance, this solution, and there's multiple solutions, and they're all better, and they all have pros and cons for different things. For instance, changing the structure of the page, if the page is already built, might mean a lot of work. The tab and arrow key solution might have other cons, but this solution, for instance, would allow the user to get to the filters in only 7 tabs. So the first tab would get them to the the number of travelers. Second tab to the departure city, then arrival city, dates. Then it would get to the group of flights. And if you want to navigate that, you would use the arrow keys, right? But if you group it as a single element, and this you would have to tell the developer to do that. Then you can bypass it with a single tab, and then you can quickly get to the filters. So that's exactly how it's done, and that's really good. And as other people mentioned, changing the structure of the page might also address it in different ways. All of these things and a combination of those things are really good answers. So design decisions must be communicated. As these decisions that we've talked about, they must be communicated to your development team prior to implementation, ideally. But how? And this is where we get to the concept of green lines. And I know I have only 5 minutes, so I'm going to go fairly fast. And I'll try to get to the answers as well. But green lines basically is a term that we use at Google, and I know other companies use green lines as well. There is no standard name for this. I was actually talking to Vero when he was planning this lecture, and he was saying, he couldn't find much about green lines, and it's because it goes by many names: green lines, blue lines, accessibility annotations. There's no standard name, unfortunately. I think that needs to be addressed, but that's beyond this out. But the concept is similar. And essentially, green lines is a process for documenting accessibility specifications. So basically what they do is translate the visual UI into a text-based linear experience. We've seen what that looks like, right? That tab navigation. So the way that they should be created is a collaboration between designers, writers, and engineers. Yes, this is essentially a deliverable that ultimately the engineer is the recipient, because it's basically telling the engineer how to implement the design, how to act in certain cases. But it's a really good idea to bring engineers in early to make sure that there's a common understanding from the beginning on how this is created and what it's trying to communicate. Green lines are basically divided into three big areas. One deals with structure, the second one deals with flow, and the third one deals with elements. So structure essentially tells you the different landmarks around the page, as well as the headings. The reason why this is important is because landmark navigation is an option, right? So you can very quickly let the user know, jump to different sections of a page, main content, menu, etc., by navigating through landmarks. Similarly, and this is important, using headings for accessibility is extremely important. I think all web, anyone that's done anything with web use or web development knows about headings H1 through H6. Sometimes we use them incorrectly because for whatever reason we've defined our styles that we like the size of H2 better for certain titles, even though logistically they should be H3. That is a problem for accessibility because the logical order makes sense, right? Like H1 is primary, then H2 goes under H1, and H3 goes under that. So even though stylistically might not be what you would have done otherwise, think about it that way. The other thing that Green Lines address is flow, and flow has to do a lot with what we just discussed for the example that we were talking about. What order is the tab navigation going to work? One of the solutions that I didn't mention, I was waiting for this slide on that exercise, is that you can actually define the tab order such that when the user gets to a certain point, the next tab is not necessarily what shows next on the page, but change that order. So maybe after the user had selected the date, the next tab would get them directly to filters. Without changing the structure of the page, without changing anything else. That would just be defined in Green Lines, and your developer would implement it that way. So focus is extremely important, as we mentioned. You need to have the user know where they are, and it is extremely important. And unfortunately, we don't have much time to get into that. But think about when you navigate to a section of the page. For instance, if you're selecting the date on your application, you're choosing a date. You go in there, you select the date, you exit from that mode of the date. You need to think about where you want your cursor to be next. Do you want it back on the date, or do you want it in the next one? This can get a lot more complex. That's a very simple example, but it's pretty easy to lose your user if you don't do it carefully, especially if your user is not sighted. Making sure that they know where they are is super important. So, now that you have seen a little bit how Green Lines work, I want you to, anytime that you see a wireframe, anytime that you see a design, think about tab navigation. Think about like elements and how you group them together, how you would go under the different ones. This is a typical media site, how you would navigate from one group of media. If you wanted to know the title of, if you wanted to get into the title of the third element in the first group, what would you do? How would you navigate that? I think accessibility, one of the interesting things about it is it makes you look at the world in a very different way. It makes you look at products in a very different way. And it trains your brain to do things that it hadn't done before. It hadn't looked at things before that way. It makes you rethink things in a very interesting way. Lastly, elements are essentially what tells the screen reader what each element is. This is a button. This is as Preethi was saying earlier. You have a group of elements. Is it the second or the third element within that group? It's important if you're not a sighted user, if you cannot see the screen, if you have a menu, it's really important to know if you're in the fourth of 7 elements or in the third of 7. So these are some of the things that are super important to remember. As I mentioned, labels need to be clear, need to convey purpose, and very directive in terms of not what are they going to do and what is really their meaning. So again, sorry that we've gone really fast. Accessibility is really a really large field. I find it fascinating. I hope some of you do as well. This was just a taste. I hope that this was enough to get you motivated to look into it more. I would love to open it to question and answers. I can stay for a bit longer. I don't know if Preethi can, and I don't know who can on your side. I don't know. I don't actually know what time it is in Australia. I don't know if you have to go to class, but I'm happy to answer some questions if you have any interest.
Yeah, I think we have some questions on the slider. Should I just copy them over?
Sure.
Okay, I'll copy them.
Actually, I see that there's a link to the questions. Hopefully this doesn't kick me out. Yeah.
I can read out the first one if you you've got it. Okay.
Sure. So how do you recommend people to get into the digital sphere when they have majors outside of digital software? I assume this gets this is addressed to me because I was a civil engineer, which is not necessarily the digital sphere, not necessarily about accessibility, but honestly, there's so much that you can learn from. There's so many places to learn from nowadays. Go to any site, learn how to make websites, learn how to make products, learn how design works. Be curious. There's tons of materials out there. YouTube is your best friend. Learn, and then do. Offer doing jobs for society. Maybe DigiSoc wants to. You can help them develop a mini site or a small size piece of their website. Learning by doing, to me, is the best thing. So I'll move on. What are some design patterns that are commonly used online that designers might not be aware of and that pose accessibility problems? There's so many. From contrast, as I was mentioning, is a huge thing. Especially if you're a designer, going with cool contrast and small fonts looks really cool. It's horrible for a lot of people. So be very careful with that. The other thing that is that I see a lot that becomes a problem is a lot of motion. Sometimes having too much motion, whether it's on a mobile device or on web, might make people just dizzy or just not react well. Be very conscious of motion and how it's used. Be purposeful with it, and keep it elegant. I love micro animations, but keep them to a good point. What would a typical day of my work look like? I wake up at 5 a.m. and go crazy at work, but so you don't want to know that. No, but I'll go for some of the accessibility questions for now. But Google is a great place to work. Once you're ready, look it up. We definitely have offices in Sydney, so it's a really magical place to work, I find. So what does the 11 in A11Y stand for? That's really that's kind of a really interesting and relevant question. So we do that in some terms at Google when they're like long words. So there's 11 letters between A and Y. When you have a long term like this that you're typing like 20 times a day, putting A11Y, everyone knows that that's accessibility, right? Like those 11 letters are there. However, there's a problem with it. It's not an accessible word. If you put that on any screen reader, the screen reader is going to read A11Y, and that is not necessarily a good idea to use, right? If even though it's more convenient, it's not an accessible word, and we're kind of generally encouraging people to stop using it. So a lot more typing.
Yeah, to add a little bit more context, I think some of that stemmed from the convention or terminology used in computer engineering, right? So A11Y. I think a few people started calling it's referring to ally, but it's a bit controversial, I would say. There were a lot of back and forth on social media. So, yep, that's that.
So I will grab one more question. So how is contrast measured to generate contrast ratios? There's quite a few websites, software, and tools that you can download, and basically you go into anywhere and it tells you the contrast ratio of two colors. Or even there are tools such as something called Andi, ANDI, that you can easily install as an extension to your Chrome, and you open, you launch it and you open any website, and it tells you problems that it might have, accessibility problems that it might have. And one of the things that it shows is contrast ratios. Other thing that it might show is, things that have font sizes are too small or improperly labeled, things like that. So lots of resources there. I would say Google it, but there's lots of stuff there. Let's see, Preethi, you want to take one of them?
Sure. I think there are a few questions that are specific to the product, like the one on YouTube. We may not be able to speak to that, especially on like reliability. I see a question there about prioritizing features while keeping in mind accessibility. And I think this is just like how the topic, I think there was a great opening by Pablo where he was saying accessibility is not a very widely recognized topic. But then within Google, it is actually factored in the mission statement. And so sometimes it gets prioritized higher, but then there are competing priorities for some features as well, right? So you want to actually start off with implementing the feature, and then you want to slowly start incorporating accessibility, and that's where some of what I was talking about with like user research. If you are actually going to talk to 10 users, try to talk to 3 of them who have disability, right? So that's how you start introducing accessibility in the product design.
I would actually add I would actually add to that is actually one of the very hard things about accessibility. It does take work, and it's an additional expense to product development, because you're putting resources and time into making a product accessible. One of the best ways for it to happen is awareness. I think accessibility is a relatively newer, strong push in many places. One of the reasons that I do a lot of awareness things. This is exactly what I'm doing here. I want people to know about accessibility, because the more people know about it, the more it will get promoted and prioritized, and more importance it'll be given in the world. And I do think it's super important. One of the things that I'll leave this as my last comment. The reason why I think accessibility is so important is at Google, for instance, my department is cloud AI. We're building the artificial intelligence tools that are basically going to build the future of technology. basically we build tools for developers that work in artificial intelligence and machine learning, and they are going to be using our tools. Now, if we only give those tools to people that can see the screen and use a mouse and are completely fine physically able-bodied, we're making the divide between disabled people and non-disabled people much greater. So we're actually making the problem even bigger. So that is why we have to fight to make products accessible to help bring everyone up to the next level, not just some.
Yep, right on. Yeah, that's great. I see there's a question on, let's see. I think this might be something that, wait, it says, how does Google cater for people who haven't even used technology before? That's a great question, right? So a lot of this would be with ethnography, first trying to understand what is the need of the user before you even jump into figuring out a solution. I think this is where you want to participate with the user in their community and have them tell us what need you should be solving. And I think that's where we don't necessarily assume that everyone needs technology for everything, right? So you want to first talk to the user and you want to place them in the center of any product that you're implementing. There is another question there. I think, Pablo, I think you might be able to take that. If you scroll, it says, I think you want to scroll a bit further. How well does Google?
We can put a question.
Yeah. Yeah, right after that, it says, how well does, yeah.
So typically Google aims to have their products meet WCAG AAA, which is, that's the highest accessibility standard. Basically WCAG has AAA, AA, but we always aim for the highest. As I mentioned, accessibility has not always been around as a main priority. It is becoming much more important lately. So a lot of the efforts right now are about making retroactively products accessible. So many of the products are not there yet. I will admit to that, but that is part of the work that's being done right now. So yes, it is a hard standard to meet, especially when you already have products that are like huge and have been around for years. Going back and making changes is very tricky. So yeah.
Yeah, we may have skipped two questions. I think there was one about COVID-19. How has the pandemic impacted UX accessibility landscape and the projects you're working on at Google? That's an interesting question. I don't know if the pandemic really had a direct impact. What do you think, Pablo? I'm not. I wouldn't associate changes.
Actually, one of the things that it definitely impacted is the ability to interact with users that that would be testing disabled users that would be testing our products. We have a few in different offices at Google. We have one in New York, one in Seattle, and one in the San Francisco Bay Area. Basically, accessibility centers where we have all of these accessible technologies, and we have multiple people that work there and that they're either blind or deaf that really help understand how the product is better for someone that really has the deficiency. It's a huge difference to think that you understand how a screen reader works to be a blind user that uses screen reader all day long. I highly encourage you to look at YouTube videos of I forget her name, but there's a teenage girl in the US that shows a lot of videos of how she uses her cell phone, her iPhone as a blind user, and it's incredible to see the speed at which they navigate through. A sighted user would never be able to do it just because we don't have that muscle developed.
Yeah, that's a great point. I think possibly one of the things pandemic had impacted is just having in-person interaction during user research, right? Everyone kind of switched to a remote world. One other thing, as I was hearing Pablo's talk about, is there could have been more of situational disabilities that we might not have thought about now that everyone is switching over to digital world and being in a remote setup. Probably the last question that we can take, because I think we are 15 minutes over, is there was a question that I thought we skipped. Which disability is most challenging to design for? And I hope you're referring to the 3 categories, permanent, temporary, or situational, because if that's what you're referring to, I would actually say, all of them are equally important. It's not about which is more challenging, it is more about which one we are trying to meet. Although I would actually want to hear Pablo also, share his insights.
Yeah, actually, my answer to that would be slightly different. One thing that we have to remember is disabilities are not mutually exclusive, right? You can be blind and deaf. How are you going to use a screen reader in that case? You could be blind and have no hands. How are you going to use a Braille keyboard in that case? So it's the combinations are really tricky, and they really make things much harder. And sometimes it's almost impossible to address the problem. But you look for the best possible way to address it.
Cool, that's great.
Okay, thank you guys so much. Thank you, Preethi and Pablo, for offering up your time. Yeah, I'm sure that many of us will be referring back to this presentation many times when we're designing